Welcome back to Squawk Box. We are here in downtown Soho, joined by a very special guest this morning. Paul Tudor Jones is here. He's the founder and chief investment officer of Tudor Investment Corporation. Of course, he is also the founder of the Robinhood Foundation, which is hosting its annual investor conference in partnership with J.P. Morgan right here. That's going to begin tomorrow, and we're thrilled to have you on the program.
So good to see you again.
So good to see you. We got to talk about a lot of things because we are now 14 days away from the election, and I think everyone is trying to make sense of this market and where things are headed and where things are going, and maybe, depending on who you think is going to win the presidency, how that's going to impact this. So where are we?
Well, for me and in the hedge fund world, this is kind of the macro Super Bowl coming up on November 5th. And I think this one, you know, some elections are not that binary. This one is binary, not so much because of which candidate wins, but it's binary in the sense that what is the market's response going to be to either candidate if they win? And so we can either continue down the path we've been on, which I'm going to kind of frame here in a second, or we may have that point of recognition where all of a sudden the markets have different ideas than what the candidates have been espousing. So
before you lay out where you think that piece of it is, let me just ask you this. So Stan Druckenmiller said that he's convinced by market indicators right now that Trump will win. And I'm curious if you agree with that thesis. Part of it is that he's looking at, you know, Polymarket and the betting markets. Part of it is he's looking at the shares of DGT. Part of it he's looking at Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly the markets are saying he's going to win. I think they're heavily skewed by Republicans, so I don't know if I necessarily believe the betting markets, but I don't have any great insights. I really don't. I just would be more skeptical of them than I would normally. It's the same way, look, in football betting, right? You can get a huge home bias where the line doesn't reflect reality. So, yeah, I know what they're saying, and I respect them.
But what about other investors? Dan Loeb recently came out with a report to his investors saying that he's positioning or repositioning his portfolio around the thesis that former President Trump will become the president.
And I have also, if I'm being honest, primarily because I see the polling numbers have clearly moved in this direction.
You say also, meaning you've repositioned as if former President Trump wins.
Yes, yes, I've moved in that direction for sure.
And what does that mean?
It just means more inflation trades, which I'd love to get to, but right. I think it's really important that we frame where we are right now, and where we are is an incredible moment in U.S. history. And what I really want to talk about is the debt trajectory that we're on. So we've gone in the space of 25 short years from debt to GDP at the federal level from about 40% to almost 100%. 60% in 25 years. And if you look at what our trajectory, what CBO projects our trajectory to be, as well as what we see as and we're going to project further than CBO. So I'm going to show you a chart. This is debt to GDP. So CBO says that we go from 98 to 122, I think 124. That's very conservative over the next 10 years. If you extrapolate that 30 years, you get to 200% debt to GDP. And so that's something, obviously something that can't go on forever, won't. And the question is, after this election, will there be some point of recognition, particularly with all the tax cuts that are being promised by both sides and the spending plans? I mean, they're handing out tax cuts like they're Mardi Gras beads, right? We're doing tax cuts on everything from tips to toucans. So it's crazy what's being promised. After the election, I think the fact that you've got 7 to 8% budget deficits as far as the eye can see, the question is, will the markets allow either candidate? I think under Trump, the deficit goes up by $500 billion per year. Under Harris's plan, it goes up by an additional $600 billion plan per year. I have a feeling all of those are just pipe dreams. I think the chances of any of those being enacted are...
You mean that the tax cuts that they're putting on the table during the campaign?
Those have zero chance of being enacted in my mind. I think the markets will, the debt markets for sure. The Treasury market won't tolerate it. So
why do you think that the Treasury market continues to tolerate it now?
Well, you know, it's so funny because financial crises percolate for years, but they blow up in weeks. That's kind of the history of them, right? And so for me, this election becomes one of those seminal points where all of a sudden, let me really think whether this proposition that the U.S. government is making me is something that I actually want to participate in. And I just want to, and I want to try to frame in layman's terms. Let's assume that I'm making $100,000 a year. You've lent me, because we're such great friends, $700,000. That's what you've lent me. And I come to you and say, okay, Andrew, I'm going to pay all that back to you in 30 years. But between now and when I ultimately pay you back, I want to borrow $40,000 every year for the next 30 years. And then at the end of 30 years, I'm going to pay the whole thing back. Would you lend me that money?
Unlikely.
You son of a bitch.
Right.
I thought you were my friend.
Well, this is the problem that we have.
Okay, so that's actually the proposition that the U.S. government makes to every bondholder today. That's the exact same proposition. So think about this. We owe $35 trillion. Our tax take is $5 trillion. So we owe 7 times what our tax take will be this year. Our revenues will be this year. And our deficit is $2 trillion, and it's $2 trillion right now as far as the eye can see. That is literally the proposition that the U.S. government is making to someone who buys a 30-year bond.
So I'm not disagreeing with you. The question is, life is relative, so some people would say, sure, you can either buy bonds from the U.S. or you could buy bonds from some other country that has an even worse situation.
Or you cannot buy bonds.
At all.
Right. So anyway, I was watching this Vince McMahon documentary, and in it, and I loved wrestling, particularly when Stone Cold and The Rock and all of them. So in it, there's a term that I'd never heard of called kayfabe. And in wrestling parlance, that represents the unspoken, unwritten, tacit agreement between the wrestlers and the fans about the illusion that's going on in the ring, the suspension of disbelief that what's going on in the ring is actually, we know it's scripted and we know it's a performance, but they ask us to think it's genuine and real.
And so that's what you think this is?
Yeah, we're in an economic kayfabe right now. And it's not just the United States, we're in it in the UK, in France, Greece, Italy, Japan being the biggest of all. It's this economic kayfabe, and the question is after this election, will we have a Minsky moment here in the United States in U.S. debt markets? Will we have a Minsky moment where all of a sudden there's a point of recognition that what's going to happen or what they're talking about is actually fiscally impossible, financially impossible?
So are you betting on a Minsky moment?
I am clearly not going to own any fixed income, and I'm going to be short the back end of fixed income because it's just completely the wrong price. But I just want to add one more thing.
Yep.
And this is why this election, I think, is so, I find it so interesting because the candidates and the parties are so interested in winning this election. But if you look at it, certainly from a fiscal standpoint, you're winning the booby prize. And let me just make this a little more complicated. In addition to the problems that we have fiscally, the United States has a net international investment position that is negative 80% of GDP. I think we've got a
chart on that. Yep.
And so minus 80% of GDP, it's roughly over 20 trillion. And that kind of shows, that traces the history of our net international investment position. So just let me define that real quick. It means foreigners own $20 trillion more of U.S. assets than we own of foreign assets. That's how you get to the minus 80% or the 20 trillion. How do we get there? It's actually a good thing. Why do we have so many of our assets owned by the rest of the world? Because we're the leader in technology.
Right.
We're the greatest arena for free markets that there is. We promote and engender. Can I use that word today, engender? We promote and engender. We promote and engender entrepreneurialism. We generally hold in high esteem the people of best. So anyway, so think about this. The problem with having a $20 trillion net international investment deficit is that you're also beholden to the kindness of strangers. So now we're going to have this election. The next president's going to come in, whoever that is, and they're looking at, okay, I've got $20 trillion that could have wings on it, as well as I've got a fiscally unsustainable path. What do I do? And that's why I'll tell you, I don't know if you've ever seen those goats that kind of perch themselves on the side of dams, and you go, gosh, how do they do that? How do they hold themselves on the side of the dam like that? That's what I think the next administration, whoever it is going to be facing. You're going to have the smartest and the most sensitive president, Treasury Secretary. That Treasury Secretary damn well better be from Wall Street, no markets. It cannot be a corporate head who does not understand the plumbing of the financial system.
So who do you think is going to get you that Treasury Secretary?
I don't know. And then, frankly, and then let me just say one last thing. And our Fed chairperson, our Fed chairman, and the next chairperson after that, the three of them have to be brilliantly connected to be able to stick this landing. Because again, if I look at debt to GDP, the path that we're on, it's rising faster than the ocean.
Okay, but let me ask you this, and maybe we can show this chart, because also the only way to solve this is to figure out a way to raise enough money where at least the math starts to make some semblance of sense.
Yeah, but before, let me just quickly show where we are in terms of our tax take relative to the rest of the world. So I think there's a quick chart on that.
Yep.
It shows 5 countries. And it goes from the U.S. at the lowest end, 29.3% of GDP is what our tax take is, to France at the highest end. And you can kind of see there's Canada, Japan, the U.K.
Now, before we get into our own math, let me just ask you a question. One reason why some people would say the U.S. is as successful as it is because it is less of a regulatory state, less of a tax state, and is probably representative of that on the screen. And when you go down that list and say to yourself, how successful is the U.S. relative to how successful is France, do you say to yourself that France is less successful because its tax rate is higher?
I would unequivocally agree with that. It's like everything. There's a fine line. There's a needle that you've got to thread, right? You could also say one of the reasons why the U.S. is so dominant is because we fast-forwarded so much future income by spending so much in a deficit standpoint, right? And it's really occurred. To be frank with you, the guy that started it was Trump, right? He inherited a 3% budget deficit in 2016. In 2019, that was close to 5% pre-COVID, before COVID. And then, of course, Biden gets in and sees what Trump has done and says, here, let me raise you one with the Inflation Reactivation Act. And, here we are today. So can I just say, between Trump and Harris, you've probably got the two people least suited for the job that's ahead of them. Least suited for the job that's ahead of them. And that's why it's going to be, again, after the election, it's going to be so important.
Let me ask you.
And I do think they know. I think we're doing also a political kayfabe with them. They know that they're not going to do these spending programs. I think they know that. It can't happen.
Okay, but if both of these folks you think are the wrong people, but it's still a binary choice, what is your choice?
I'm going to keep that private, and the reason I'm going to keep that private is because there's a lot of causes that I'm really invested in. Robinhood's one of them, the environment, and I'm going to end up working with people on both sides. We're a really divided country right now, and I want to make sure I have great relations with whichever administration goes on, because I want to continue serving the millions of people that I do, and the billions of critters that I love.
Let's talk about taxes, though.
Okay.
Because that's how the money is going to get raised.
Correct.
One way or the other.
Correct.
I think we have a screen, if we could, that puts up a little bit of a menu here.
Yes.
Of, I don't know if it's options. Actually, they may not be options at all.
There are plenty of options. There are plenty of options.
But there's not many ways to get where you need to go unless you start to do some of these things.
Correct.
Maybe. So the question is, of what's on the screen, you can let the tax cuts expire. That gets you
look, can I just say this?
Yep.
You have to let the tax cuts expire.
You have to.
Yeah, you have to let those expire. That's $390 billion. We're going to have, again, we're gonna be broke really quickly unless we get serious about dealing with our spending issues, and unless we can either. I don't know if we'll be able to cut spending that much. 60% of our spending are transfer payments.
But if you think we're going broke, and you think Trump is going to be the president, he's not going to let those tax cuts expire if he can avoid it.
The thing
he does not want the corporate tax rate to go to 25%, as you're suggesting it'll have to. He's suggesting it should go to 15%.
I'm saying that just to get us to the point where we stabilize debt to GDP at where it is right now, here's what you need to do. You need to let the Trump tax cuts expire. That's $390 billion. You need to raise the payroll tax on every single working person, 1%. That's another big slug. You need to...
What do you think that does to jobs?
We're clearly going to have a period of contraction, which hopefully, that's why I was going to say, it's going to be really important for the Fed to be able to offset the fiscal contraction area that's going to come.
Then you want to increase the individual tax rate all the way to the top rate of close to 50%.
No, hold it.
Yep.
I don't want to do any of this stuff. What I'm telling you is that we've got to be serious about where we are fiscally. And so I'm giving you, there's a whole set of options, right? We could go in and cut 25% of the federal workforce. Some people may do that. There's a website where you can go look and play with all the options. You can raise the capital gains rate from 21 to 28%. That only gets you $10 billion a year. It actually doesn't get you what you need. So I'm simply showing some of the things that you can do. Yes, you'd have to raise the tax rate on the top, I think probably everyone over 200 grand, probably have to raise that to 49.5%. If you do all these things, raise the Social Security from 65 to 70. If you do all these things, means test, Medicare, if you do all these things, all you do is you get to a primary balance. What that means is you stabilize debt to GDP. You're still actually increasing your debt.
Right.
You're still actually increasing it because it excludes the interest costs, which, oh, by the way, the interest bill this year is larger than every single line item except Social Security. It's larger than defense spending, larger than Medicare.
I want to talk about why you're here, which is Robinhood and this conference. But before I do that, is this, given all of the things you're saying, are you off buying gold and Bitcoin and
I think all roads lead to inflation. We're going to end up,
But does all roads lead to inflation, therefore gold is a good investment? Is Bitcoin a good investment to you?
I'm long gold. I'm long Bitcoin. I think commodities are so ridiculously underowned, so I'm long commodities. I think most young people find their inflation hedges via the NASDAQ. That's also been great. It's probably some combination. I probably have some basket of gold, Bitcoin, commodities, and NASDAQ, something like that, and I would own zero fixed income. If I had my cash, it'd be very short term. The playbook to get out of this, you see it in Japan right now. They have 2% inflation, 30 basis points overnight. They don't want to raise rates. The playbook to get out of this is that you inflate your way out and you have a small tax on the consumer and you run interest rates and nominal growth rate, interest rates below inflation and nominal growth above inflation. And that's how you reduce your debt to GDP. So you're going to have the Fed, they should be easy. They should be.
It should be easy. You want them to cut.
So just real quickly, every 100 basis points, given where our debt to GDP right now, every 100 basis points is worth about $90 billion a year to the deficit. $90 billion. So yes, if we're trying to stabilize debt to GDP, we want to run the most dovish monetary policy that we can without letting inflation become too much of a tax on the citizenry. So yes, all roads lead to inflation. That's historically the way every civilization has gotten out, is they've inflated away their debts.
We're going to run out of time, but I want to talk about this because this is also your Super Bowl of the year.
Best day of the year, best day of the fall, and that's our investor conference. It's sold out. It's fantastic. We've got everyone from Seth Klarman, Jamie Dimon, David Einhorn, Bill Gates finishes at the end of the day. I have a great talk with Ken Tropin. Most importantly, you have to think about, I think about Robin Hood and I think New York this way. You're only as strong as your weakest, the chain's only as strong as the weakest link. The weakest link in any society are the most needy, the underserved, the people who are at the bottom. So that's what we do. We're the spear point for helping those people in this city so we can keep a strong city and a strong society.
Paul Tudor Jones, kayfabe, right? That's the phrase.
Economic kayfabe.
Economic kayfabe. Fascinating. Thank you for this. Appreciate it very, very much.
Thank you so much.
You bet. Joe, I'm going to send it back to you, sir.
Very good. All right. Thank you.
He was saying the quiet part out loud. This is what people won't say about the Treasury markets and what's happening and the potential.
We got to inflate it away
to get things under control.
Ask. I didn't know. It's a total aside, Andrew. We love Paul's daughter, and we're big fans. And I don't know if everyone knows Zach Brown Band. He doesn't brag much, does he?
This guy?
Yeah. Zach Brown Band.
He's not a bragger.
No, not a bragger. But I just found that out, Paul, and we're both fans,
impressed.
Right?
Yeah. Impressed.
Very, very impressed. Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, tell him. I don't think he has an IFB, Andrew, but I think Carolyn, is that her name? I think we were talking about Carolyn Jones. Programming note, by the way, Pershing Square's Bill Ackman. We had Paul Tudor Jones today. Bill Ackman will join us tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. Eastern time. Here's a final check on the markets. And if I had talked to Paul, I would have, I keep thinking about the 420 on the 10-year and the new high in the gold. Because he's saying these things are going to happen then, but these are little things that may be indicating what he's talking about right now.
He also told Andrew, he said that he would not buy treasuries and that he would be short on the long end of it.
Right.
And I think
all roads lead to inflation, which means bonds aren't, that yield may continue. We may still be early.
By the way, this is stuff that is, again, whispered about, but not very often said out loud.
Right.
And not somebody saying, look out, beware. Right now you're looking at the 10-year at 4.18. You're looking at the 2-year above 4%, 4.03%. You can talk about a lot of reasons that might be, but I think Paul Tudor Jones just laid out some big issues.
The only other, you still do have to, that's why I get excited about the idea that Elon Musk could wring some of the excess problems, regulation, spending out of it, and then hope for growth, because we're not going to solve it just from raising taxes. I don't think that's, a lot of people, it's going to be a combination.
You need to raise taxes and cut spending, and that is not what the political parties are laying out right now.
But it's going to be solved through growth.